From the morning of January the 31st, 1990, through the 2 years that followed, something very strange went on in Moscow. People lined up before dawn for an American hamburger. The lines sometimes stretched several blocks, with customers waiting up to 6 hours in sub-zero temperatures, paying the equivalent of half their day's wages to just walk through a set of golden arches. In retrospect, the symbolic meaning here might have been a bit deeper, as some scholars observed that these Soviets were actually lining up at McDonald's to take a crack at the Iron Curtain itself. Perhaps that worked, since within just 2 years, the Soviet Union would be gone. McDonald's, meanwhile, kept selling hamburgers throughout it all. So, how exactly did McDonald's establish itself in the capital city of America's greatest Cold War enemy, and why did it recently fall apart? Stay tuned to find out as we discover the history of McDonald's in the Soviet Union. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching Eats History. To understand what opening a McDonald's behind the Iron Curtain meant, you first need to understand what McDonald's had already become in America by the 1970s. The company was founded by the McDonald brothers in San Bernardino, California in 1940, initially as a drive-through barbecue stand. In 1948, they retooled it into something new, a kitchen stripped of everything slow, organized around speed, uniformity, and a short menu. They called this the Speedy Service System, featuring just a few key products like burgers, fries, shakes, and nothing else. Amazingly, it worked. But the real explosion would come in 1954, when a milkshake machine salesman named Ray Kroc visited their operation and saw something that the brothers hadn't fully grasped, a franchise model that could scale across the country. From there, Kroc bought rights, built the corporation, and in 1961 had bought out the McDonald's brothers entirely for $2.7 million. From there, he did something that would define the company's global ambitions. He opened Hamburger University in Oak Brook, Illinois. This was a genuine training institution for franchise operators where the science of consistency was instituted. By the mid-1970s, McDonald's Corporation had planted its golden arches across North America, Europe, and Asia. It was the largest restaurant chain on Earth, and in the minds of millions, it had become shorthand for America itself, which is precisely why what happened next was so outrageous. In 1976, the Summer Olympics came to Montreal, and among the visitors was a Soviet delegation preparing the logistics for the 1980s Moscow Games. And as they were scouting venues, suppliers, vendors, and so on, a man named George Cohon, the founder and CEO of McDonald's Canada, spotted an opportunity. George was an opportunistic man. He built his Canadian operations from scratch after purchasing the Eastern Canada franchise rights in 1967 with a borrowed $70,000. By 1976, he was running 200 locations and was not a man who missed an opening. Hence, he did something politically taboo for the time. He invited the Soviet delegation to one of his restaurants. And I want you to really imagine this. Hardened communist officials staring wide-eyed at the menu board or eating their first Big Macs with what witnesses described as a bewildered enthusiasm. So George asked them directly, would Russians enjoy going to a McDonald's in Moscow if one existed? They replied in Russian, of course we'll go. That was all he needed. He immediately began pursuing the idea of feeding the 1980s Moscow Olympics. After years of preliminary work, the plan collapsed, however, at the highest levels of the Soviet government on ideological grounds. Soviet leadership couldn't stomach the optics of capitalism's most recognizable symbol operating inside a communist showcase. And then came another blow when the U.S. boycotted the games over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 67 countries followed. In retrospect, this was something of a lucky escape for George, as McDonald's would have been photographed at an event that the U.S. government officially condemned. But Cohon didn't just walk away. He recalibrated. What followed was one of the most patient corporate campaigns in modern history. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Cohon made trip after trip to Moscow. He cultivated relationships at every level of the Soviet bureaucracy. However, he wasn't selling hamburgers yet. He was selling trust. The structural obstacles were immense. Remember, Western companies could not simply move money in and out of the Soviet Union. The ruble was non-convertible on the international market, meaning profits couldn't be repatriated. Furthermore, any businesses operating in the USSR back then had to operate under a joint venture structure, which meant partial state ownership, Soviet partners, and layers of bureaucratic oversight that could kill a deal at any moment. All the same, an opportunity arose in 1985 when Gorbachev introduced new government projects that allowed for joint ventures with Western companies for the first time. This program signaled to the world that the USSR was serious about reform. Cohon, who had been waiting for nearly a decade at this point, moved on the opportunity fast. In 1988, a formal agreement was signed with the state and Moscow City Food Service Agency, and the terms were 51% Soviet-owned, 49% McDonald's Canada-owned. On those grounds, 20 restaurants would be built in Moscow, along with a dedicated food processing facility just outside the city. And although the deal was done, the hard part was only beginning. The problems began with the fact that the Soviet Union had no private food suppliers capable of meeting McDonald's standards. And if you think back to McDonald's University, you'll remember that consistency was everything. A Big Mac in Toronto had to taste exactly the same in Tokyo or Moscow. To achieve that, within a common economy where supply chains were unreliable and quality control was essentially non-existent, the company had to do something radical. With no precedent in its history, it had to build its own supply chain. At a cost of $45 million, or 5 times what the restaurants in Russia would cost themselves, McDonald's constructed McComplex in a district on the outskirts of Moscow. The 100,000 square foot facility contained a meat processing line, a bakery, a dairy center, a potato processing line for fries, a pie line, and a quality control laboratory. And everything was under one roof because it had to be. From there, McDonald's experts worked directly with Soviet farms to cultivate that perfect potato variety for the fries. Furthermore, they got involved in cattle ranching to achieve that specific lean to fat specification. So what I'm saying is that they essentially introduced modern agricultural quality to an entire region. The restaurant itself was built to reflect the project's ambitions as well. Located on Pushkin Square, named for Russia's most celebrated poet, at the cultural center of the capital, this establishment seated 700 people. At the time, it was the largest McDonald's in the world. Meanwhile, Cohon made one more critical decision that said everything about his strategy. The Moscow McDonald's would only accept rubles. This was a deliberate signal. The restaurant wasn't for diplomats and foreigners, it was for locals. Before opening, over 27 of the most promising Soviet managers flew to the US and Canada for training. After training, they returned to Moscow and prepared their crew of 600 employees for the Pushkin Square location. It also warrants mentioning that one of the skills those employees specifically practiced was a bit unorthodox, if not taboo, in the USSR: smiling at customers. On opening day, people began lining up at 4 a.m. By 6:30 in the morning, 10,000 people were already waiting. By the time the doors opened at 10, the queue stretched for several city blocks around the square, with scores of police officers deployed to manage the crowd. A Big Mac cost 3 rubles 75, a cheeseburger 175, and fries 1 ruble. For context, the average monthly Soviet salary at the time was around 150 rubles. So this food was not cheap. Yet by the end of the day, over 30,000 customers have been served, smashing the previous McDonald's single-day record of 9,100 in Budapest. Accordingly, the location stayed open hours past the planned closing time because the crowds would simply not leave. The Western press was transfixed on this news, with the New York Times calling it, quote, a triumph of capitalistic determination. Another American reporter observed that Moscow's first McDonald's customers had, quote, seen the future, and it worked, at least as far as their digestive tract. Inside the USSR, the reaction was complicated. One customer expressed doubt, recalling, quote, it will all go downhill. We don't know how to run a restaurant like this. A teacher named Tatiana told reporters that what struck her most wasn't the food, it was the staff. She said the workers' sincere smiles themselves were a lesson for the country, though some employees noted that when they smiled at the customers, many would simply ask, what's wrong? You see, in Soviet service culture, a smile from a stranger implied mockery. Even so, most people were very amused by the experience. Customers took the paper cups and wrappers home as souvenirs, since they had never seen packaging like that in their life. Within months, the line at Pushkin Square had become a permanent fixture of Moscow. For the 2 years that followed, that line rarely dropped below an hour. The restaurant was serving between 40 and 50,000 customers a day, making it comfortably the busiest McDonald's on the planet back then. On December the 26th, 1991, the USSR ceased to exist. Gorbachev resigned, and 15 republics declared independence. In other words, the country was gone. Yet McDonald's somehow stayed open through it all. In the chaos of the early 90s, with hyperinflation running at over 2,000% annually, economic collapse, political upheaval, and all the rest of it, the restaurant became one of the few consistent things in Moscow public life. This was important because McDonald's was one of the few places that continued paying its workers. It maintained its supply chain and just kept building. By '93, the McComplex was purchasing 90% of its ingredients within the former Soviet Union. So what McDonald's had done, without entirely intending to, was plant the seeds of a private food industry in a country that never had one. Every supplier that grew beyond the McComplex became an independent business. So as things were falling apart, dozens of new companies rose, bakeries, farms, etc. For this accomplishment, Boris Yeltsin awarded George Cohon Russia's Order of Friendship with the title Hero of Capitalist Labor. By 2022, there would be 850 McDonald's locations in Russia, with approximately 62,000 employees. And yet, that state of affairs would come to unravel fast. In February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, McDonald's initially suspended operations while continuing to pay its employees, an arrangement that cost the company tens of millions of dollars per month. Hence, in May of that year, it announced a permanent exit by selling its Russian operations to a Siberian licensee. And with that, the former locations reopened under a new Russian name, meaning delicious full stop. The Big Mac became the big hit with a reformulated sauce and a revised recipe. Coca-Cola also withdrew from Russia and was replaced with a local alternative. Apparently, the transfer didn't happen without incident. Reportedly, one man handcuffed himself to a McDonald's door in protest before the closure, shouting that the shutdown was an act of hostility against him and his fellow citizens. Furthermore, there were also reports that the new chain had run out of potatoes within months due to a poor harvest. And with that, the complete irony was in place. The chain built to replace Russia's most reliable restaurant couldn't keep fries on the menu. George Cohon, who died in Toronto in November of 23 at the age of 86, called what he did burger diplomacy. And I think we might all agree that it's a modest name for something that operated on the scale most diplomats couldn't match. He personally introduced market economics to build an industry. He built an independent supply chain where none existed and created one of the most symbolic cultural moments of the Cold War's final chapter. Anyhow, that's the story of how McDonald's opened in the USSR and how it eventually fell. I hope you liked the episode. If you did, hit that subscribe button. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.